I'm Elizabeth, 35 years old, and I never imagined my parents could sink this low. Standing in my son Tommy's room, I stared at the wrapped gift box I'd just found hidden behind his dresser. Inside were plain white socks with a note that made my blood run cold, the worst gift for the worst grandson. Tommy's 8th birthday party was starting in 2 hours, and this was what my parents planned to give him while they showered my sister Claire's children with expensive toys and gadgets. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've ever dealt with family favoritism or know someone who has, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like mine. Trust me, what happens next at this birthday party will shock you. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone in dealing with toxic family members. Now, let me tell you how this simple pair of socks exposed 20 years of lies and led to my parents' downfall. The morning sun streamed through the windows as I frantically set up Tommy's dinosaur-themed birthday party, trying to push down the rage boiling inside me. Green streamers twisted from the ceiling, prehistoric balloons clustered in corners, and a massive T-Rex cake dominated the dining table. Tommy had been talking about this party for weeks, carefully selecting which school friends to invite, planning every game and activity with the excitement only an 8-year-old could muster. My hands trembled as I arranged the party favors, that cruel note echoing in my mind. How could grandparents be so heartless to an innocent child? But deep down, I wasn't surprised. This was just the latest in a long pattern of emotional abuse my parents had inflicted on us while treating my sister Claire's family like royalty. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:30, and my parents strolled in 15 minutes late, barely glancing at the decorations I'd spent hours creating. "Hello, Elizabeth," my mother said coolly, her eyes scanning the room with obvious disapproval. "Rather loud, isn't it?" My father simply grunted, already checking his phone, probably looking at photos Claire had sent of her twins' latest accomplishments. "Tommy's in the backyard with his friends," I said, forcing a smile. "He's been so excited to see you both." The lie tasted bitter. Tommy had actually asked me that morning if Grandma and Grandpa would remember his birthday this year. Last year, they'd forgotten entirely, claiming they thought it was the following week despite the invitation clearly stating the date. As if on cue, Claire burst through the door with her twins, Mason and Maddox, both carrying multiple wrapped presents. "Sorry we're late," she chirped, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "The boys just had to finish their advanced robotics class. You know how it is with gifted children." She shot me a look that said everything. "My children are special, yours is not." My parents immediately lit up, embracing Claire and fawning over the twins. "There are our special boys," my mother cooed, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "Did you show your teacher that new iPad we got you? I bet you're the only second graders with the pro version." Mason proudly displayed his device while Maddox chimed in about their upcoming trip to space camp, fully funded by their doting grandparents. Tommy ran inside, his face flushed with excitement, dinosaur hat askew on his head. "Grandma! Grandpa," he called out, but they barely acknowledged him, too busy admiring something on Mason's screen. I watched my son smile falter, saw him straighten his party hat and try again. "Do you want to see my dinosaur collection? I got a new velociraptor." "Maybe later, Thomas," my father said dismissively, not even using Tommy's preferred nickname. "We're talking to your cousins right now." The twins smirked, and I saw Mason whisper something to Maddox that made them both giggle while looking at Tommy. The party games proceeded awkwardly. My parents sat on the patio furniture, making no effort to engage with Tommy or his friends. They called Claire over repeatedly, discussing her husband's promotion, the twins' academic achievements, and their plans to fund a swimming pool for Claire's new house. Each word was carefully chosen, loud enough for me to hear, a deliberate reminder of everything they provided for Claire and withheld from me. When gift time arrived, Tommy's school friends gathered around excitedly. He opened present after present, thanking each friend enthusiastically. The twins gave him cheap dollar store toys, clearly last-minute purchases, but Tommy thanked them graciously anyway. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. My father stood up, making a show of retrieving a small, poorly wrapped box from my mother's purse. "Here you go, Thomas," he said, his tone suggesting he was doing us an enormous favor. "Happy birthday." The other parents watched expectantly, probably assuming grandparents would give something special. Tommy's hand shook slightly as he unwrapped the gift. The room fell silent as he pulled out a single pair of plain white socks. No fun patterns, no dinosaurs, just basic white socks from a bulk pack. One of his friends whispered, "Is that really it?" and nervous giggles rippled through the group of children. "What do you say, Thomas?" my mother prompted, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Tommy's lower lip trembled, but he managed a quiet "thank you" before the dam broke. Tears streaming down his face, he dropped the socks and ran to his room, leaving stunned silence in his wake. The other parents exchanged uncomfortable glances, some already gathering their children to leave early. I stood frozen for a moment before fury propelled me forward. "How dare you?" I hissed at my parents, trying to keep my voice low enough that the remaining guests wouldn't hear everything. "How dare we?" my mother shot back, her mask of civility slipping. "That ungrateful child didn't even appreciate our gift. This is exactly why we don't waste money on him. He's spoiled and dramatic, just like his mother." Spoiled? I couldn't contain my voice anymore. "You gave Mason and Maddox iPads last week. You paid for their coding camp, their music lessons, their everything. And you give my son socks for his birthday?" My father's face hardened. "Those boys show promise. They're going places. What has Thomas ever done to deserve expensive gifts? He's average at best, and that's being generous." He paused, then delivered the blow he'd clearly been saving. "Besides, he's not really family, is he? Not like Mason and Maddox. We didn't choose to adopt you, Elizabeth. Our real daughter's children deserve our investment." The room spun. Despite being their adopted daughter for 34 years, they still didn't consider me real family. Claire stood behind them, pretending to be shocked but unable to hide the satisfied smirk playing at her lips. She'd known this was coming. Hell, she'd probably encouraged it. "Get out," I said quietly, my voice deadly calm. "Get out of my house and don't come back." My mother laughed, actually laughed, as if I'd told a joke. "Oh, Elizabeth, always so dramatic. This is exactly what I told the family about you. Unstable, ungrateful, making scenes at a children's party." She turned to the remaining parents, who were quickly ushering their children out. "I'm so sorry you had to witness this. Mental health issues run in her biological family, you know." The last guests practically ran for the door, leaving me standing in a room full of dinosaur decorations and abandoned cake, my son's sobs echoing from upstairs. Claire gathered the twins, making a show of comforting them about the scary argument they'd witnessed. As they left, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Maybe next year skip the party altogether. Save everyone the embarrassment." A week passed in a blur of comforting Tommy and fielding awkward texts from the parents who'd fled the party. I knew I couldn't let this situation continue. My son deserved better than grandparents who treated him like he was worthless. After several sleepless nights, I decided to call a family meeting at my parents' house. If I could get everyone together, surely they'd see the blatant favoritism and help me address it. I reached out to Aunt Martha, Uncle Richard, and my cousins, explaining that we needed to discuss important family matters. Everyone agreed to come, some even expressing concern about what had happened at Tommy's party. Cousin Jenny seemed especially supportive, texting me that she'd noticed the unfair treatment before and would back me up. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Saturday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, matching my anxious mood. Tommy stayed with a trusted babysitter while I drove to my parents' imposing colonial home, the place where I'd grown up feeling like an unwelcome guest. The familiar driveway triggered a flood of memories, watching Claire get a car for her 16th birthday while I got a lecture about responsibility, seeing my college acceptance letters mysteriously disappear while Claire's were framed on the wall, sitting alone at holidays while the family fawned over their real daughter. I arrived to find several cars already in the driveway. Strange, since the meeting wasn't supposed to start for another 15 minutes. My stomach clenched as I walked through the front door to find everyone already assembled in the living room, including Claire, who I hadn't invited. They all turned to look at me with expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed hostility. "There she is," my mother announced, her voice carrying that false concern she'd perfected over the years. "Everyone, thank you for coming to help us address Elizabeth's situation." My situation? I'd called this meeting, but somehow she'd hijacked it before I even arrived. Looking around the room, I realized with growing dread that they'd all been briefed already, poisoned against me before I could say a word. Aunt Martha patted the seat beside her with a sympathetic look that made my skin crawl. "Sweetie, we're all here because we care about you. Your mother explained everything, and we want to help." I remained standing, my fight-or-flight instinct screaming warnings. "Explained what, exactly?" "I called this meeting to discuss how my parents treat my son like he's worthless while spoiling Claire's children." Uncle Richard cleared his throat, his banker's demeanor making him seem like he was about to deny a loan application. "Elizabeth, we need to talk about your jealousy issues. It's not healthy to resent your sister's success or blame your parents for your own shortcomings." The words hit like physical blows. They'd completely flipped the narrative, turning me into the villain of the story. "Jealousy?" I sputtered, looking around for any sign of support. "They gave Tommy socks for his birthday. They told him he was the worst grandson. How is being upset about that jealousy?" But I could see in their faces that the battle was already lost. Whatever my parents had told them had been swallowed whole, no questions asked. Claire pulled out her phone with theatrical concern. "I've been so worried about you, Lise. Look, I even saved these texts you sent me." She showed the screen to Aunt Martha, who gasped. I caught a glimpse of messages I'd never sent, vitriolic rants about how much I hated her and wished her children would fail. "I never sent those." I protested, but Claire had already moved on to showing Uncle Richard, who shook his head sadly. "The technical evidence is pretty clear," he said, using his professional voice. "These came from your number, Elizabeth. Maybe you don't remember sending them? Your mother mentioned you'd been having memory issues, mood swings. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but you need to acknowledge the problem." My parents sat back like puppet masters watching their show unfold. My father pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. "We've been documenting Elizabeth's behavior for months now," he announced to the room. "Erratic decisions, emotional outbursts, neglecting Tommy's needs. We're concerned about our grandson's welfare." "Neglecting Tommy?" I nearly screamed. "You're the ones who forgot his birthday last year. You've never been to a single soccer game or school play." But my mother was already distributing copies of their documentation to the family members. I caught sight of photos taken out of context, twisted interpretations of normal parenting moments, even what looked like forged receipts for alcohol purchases I'd never made. Cousin Jenny, who I'd counted on for support, held up her phone. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth, but this is concerning." She played a video, and I watched in horror as it showed me from the birthday party, but edited to remove all context. It looked like I was screaming at my elderly parents for no reason while children cowered in the background. "Jenny, that's not what happened. They humiliated Tommy. The video is edited." "I took this video myself," Jenny said firmly. "There's no editing. This is exactly what happened." The betrayal stung worse than any of the others. She'd been there, she'd seen everything, and now she was lying to my face. Looking at her designer handbag and new jewelry, I wondered what my parents had promised her for her cooperation. The meeting descended into an intervention-style nightmare. Each family member took turns expressing their concerns about my mental state, my parenting, my jealousy of Claire. They cited examples that were either completely fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. Throughout it all, Claire maintained her worried sister act, occasionally dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. "We've all agreed," Aunt Martha announced, as if conducting a board meeting, that it would be best if you limited your involvement in family events for a while. Just until you get the help you need. And perhaps Tommy could spend more time with his grandparents, to provide stability. Absolutely not, I said, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. You're not taking my son anywhere near these people. My father leaned forward, his eyes cold. Be very careful, Elizabeth. We have resources you don't. If you continue making scenes and false accusations, we'll have no choice but to involve Child Protective Services. We have genuine concerns about Tommy's welfare with an unstable mother. The threat hung in the air like a poison cloud. Looking around the room at faces that had once shown me affection, I saw only strangers who'd been bought or manipulated into becoming weapons against me. Even worse, I realized this had been planned for a long time. Every interaction, every family gathering had been an opportunity for my parents to lay groundwork for this moment. I think that's enough for today, my mother said sweetly, as if we'd just finished discussing vacation plans. Elizabeth clearly needs time to process everything. We'll give you space to think about what's best for Tommy. Perhaps therapy would help with your anger issues? The family members nodded sagely, already getting up to leave, their duty to the family patriarch and matriarch complete. As I walked to my car on shaking legs, Jenny caught up with me. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, admit the truth. Instead, she leaned in close and whispered, "Your parents paid off my student loans last month. I'm sorry, but I can't afford to cross them. Maybe you should just play along until Tommy's older." Then she walked back inside, leaving me alone in the drizzle, surrounded by the wreckage of what I'd once thought was my family. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that mocked my internal turmoil. I'd spent Sunday alternating between rage and despair, trying to figure out how to protect Tommy from the toxic web my parents had woven. Work had always been my refuge, the one place where my achievements couldn't be diminished or attributed to anyone else. Walking into the marketing firm where I'd worked for 8 years, I felt a temporary relief. Here, at least, I was valued for my contributions. That relief lasted exactly until I reached my desk and found my computer locked out. The IT support ticket taped to my monitor read, "Security breach detected, see department head immediately." My blood ran cold. This couldn't be related to the family drama, could it? But as I looked up to find several coworkers quickly averting their gazes, I knew my parents' reach had extended even here. The walk to my boss Patricia's office felt like a march to the gallows. Patricia had always been fair, even motherly toward me. But she was also a family friend of my parents, attending their holiday parties and charity fundraisers. I knocked on her door with a growing sense of dread, already knowing this conversation wouldn't go in my favor. "Elizabeth, sit down," Patricia said, her usual warmth replaced by professional distance. "We need to discuss some serious concerns that have come to light." She pulled up several spreadsheets on her computer, turning the screen so I could see. "IT traced unauthorized access to confidential client files from your login. The breach occurred last Tuesday evening at 11:47 p.m. Were you in the office at that time?" Last Tuesday evening, I'd been home helping Tommy with his solar system project, trying to keep his mind off the birthday disaster. "No, I was home with my son." There must be a mistake. But even as I said it, pieces clicked into place. My mother had worked here for 20 years before retiring, maintaining her keycard access as an honorary consultant. She knew my passwords because I'd foolishly given them to her years ago when she'd offered to help with a presentation while I was out sick. Patricia's expression grew sterner. "Elizabeth, we have security footage of you entering the building that night." She pulled up grainy footage that showed a figure that could have been me, or could have been any woman with similar build and hair color. In the darkness and at that distance, positive identification was impossible. But I recognized the coat. It was one I'd donated to Claire last winter. "That's not me," I insisted, but Patricia was already moving on to the next issue. "There's more. Several of your colleagues have reported receiving inappropriate emails from your account. Would you care to explain these?" She showed me printouts of emails I'd never written, filled with petty insults and confidential information about coworkers' salaries and personal issues. Each one was perfectly crafted to cause maximum damage to my professional relationships. The pattern was becoming clear. My parents weren't just content to destroy my family relationships, they wanted to take everything from me. Patricia, please. Someone is setting me up. Check the IP addresses, the writing style, anything. This isn't me. But her face remained impassive, and I noticed a new photo on her desk from my parents' recent charity gala, Patricia smiling between them like old friends. Your mother called me yesterday, Patricia admitted, and my heart sank. She's concerned about your mental state. She mentioned the family is trying to get you help, but you're resistant. Elizabeth, I've known your parents for 15 years. They're pillars of this community. Why would they lie about their own daughter? The question hung between us, heavy with years of charitable donations, society connections, and carefully cultivated reputation. I wanted to scream that they'd lied because I was adopted, because I'd never been their real daughter, because hurting me somehow elevated Claire in their twisted worldview. But I could see it would be pointless. The narrative was already set. I'm putting you on immediate probation, Patricia continued. You'll be moved to the auxiliary office while we investigate these security breaches. Your access to sensitive files is revoked, and you'll need supervision for all client contacts. The auxiliary office. A windowless room in the basement usually reserved for interns filing paperwork. It was humiliation designed to make me quit, preserving their ability to deny unemployment benefits. The day got progressively worse. Coworkers who'd been friends for years suddenly had urgent meetings when I approached. Conversation stopped when I entered the break room. By lunch, I overheard two junior associates whispering about my family problems and speculating about whether I was safe to work with. The poison had spread through the office like wildfire, each person eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Around 2 o'clock, I discovered another piece of the puzzle. Claire's husband Mark worked in HR at our parent company. I'd forgotten about this connection until I tried to file a formal complaint about the security breach and was told all grievances regarding my situation had to go through him personally. The conflict of interest was staggering, but when I pointed this out, I was told it had been approved by upper management due to the sensitive family nature of the situation. The humiliations continued to pile up. My parking pass was mysteriously deactivated, forcing me to pay visitor rates. My office phone was redirected to go straight to voicemail. The major client presentation I'd been preparing for months was reassigned to a junior colleague who could barely hide her glee at the opportunity. When I protested, I was told it was for the client's comfort level given recent events. By Wednesday, the full scope of the sabotage became clear. My mother had been busy since her retirement, maintaining relationships with key people throughout the company. She'd laid groundwork I was only now beginning to see. Every lunch she'd had with Patricia, every charity event she'd invited coworkers to, every favor she'd done had been an investment in this moment of destruction. The final blow came Thursday afternoon. I was called into a meeting with Patricia, Mark from HR, and the company's legal counsel. They'd discovered more evidence of my supposed misconduct, emails planning to steal clients, bad-mouthing the company to competitors, even suggesting I was planning to start a rival firm using proprietary information. All of it was fabricated, but the technical trail was sophisticated enough to look legitimate to anyone who wanted to believe it. We could terminate you immediately for cause, the lawyer said, sliding papers across the table. However, given your family's long relationship with this company, we're willing to offer an alternative. Accept a demotion to entry-level marketing assistant, surrender all your accounts and clients, and agree to intensive supervision and monitoring. You'll keep your health insurance, which I understand is important for your son. They knew exactly where to strike. Tommy's asthma medication was expensive, and my insurance was the only thing making it affordable. I thought of his inhaler, his specialist appointments, his breathing treatments. They had me cornered and everyone in the room knew it. Mark couldn't quite hide his smirk as I reviewed the demotion paperwork that would cut my salary by 60% and eliminate my path to advancement. I need time to think, I said, my voice barely steady. Patricia's face softened slightly, a glimpse of the woman who'd once mentored me. Elizabeth, take the deal. Sometimes we need to be grateful for second chances, even if they're not what we hoped for. Your parents are trying to help you, in their way. Don't let pride cost you everything. I signed the papers with shaking hands, each signature feeling like another nail in the coffin of my career. Walking back to the auxiliary office, I passed the desk that had been mine for 8 years, now cleared of my personal items. A young intern was already setting up in my space, arranging her diplomas on the wall where my achievement awards had hung. That evening, I sat in my car in the visitor lot, no longer entitled to employee parking, and finally let myself cry. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Heard about your work situation. This is what happens when you make scenes and refuse to accept your place. Claire's hiring for her company if you need extra income. Think about what's best for Tommy. The cruelty was breathtaking. They'd orchestrated my professional downfall and now offered crumbs through Claire as if it were charity. But as I drove home to my son, I made a promise to myself. They might have won this battle, but I wouldn't let them destroy us completely. There had to be a way to fight back, to expose what they'd done. I just needed to find it before they took everything, including Tommy. The following Monday started with a knock at the door that would haunt me for years. 2 process servers stood on my porch at 7:30 in the morning, just as I was getting Tommy ready for school. Elizabeth Chen, one asked, though they clearly already knew who I was. I nodded mutely, accepting the thick manila envelope while trying to shield Tommy from seeing the official documents. Mommy, who are those men? Tommy asked, his backpack half-zipped and breakfast forgotten. Just some people with papers for Mommy, I said, forcing my voice to stay light. Finish your cereal while I look at these, okay? But my hands were already trembling as I recognized the family court seal on the documents. My parents were filing for grandparents' rights, citing serious concerns about the child's welfare and mother's mental stability. The petition was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. Page after page detailed my supposed failings as a mother, complete with twisted versions of real events and outright fabrications. They claimed I was denying them access to Tommy out of spite, that I was poisoning him against them, that my recent erratic behavior at work and family gatherings indicated a dangerous decline in mental health. Most damning were the attached affidavits from family members who'd been at the intervention, each swearing to my instability. I barely made it through dropping Tommy at school before the panic attack hit. Sitting in the school parking lot, I called 3 law firms, only to be told they couldn't take my case. The first 2 cited conflicts of interest I didn't understand. The third was more honest: your parents are major donors to the Legal Aid Foundation. We can't represent you against them. By the 4th call, I was beginning to understand the depth of their influence in our community. Finally, I found an attorney named David Brennan who agreed to meet with me that afternoon. His office was shabby compared to the high-powered firms I'd called first, but he seemed genuinely interested in my case. That is, until he reviewed the documents and his expression grew increasingly concerned. Ms. Chen, are you aware that your parents have hired Whitman and Associates? They handle cases for state senators, celebrities. Their retainer alone could buy my entire practice. I don't care who they hired, I said desperately. They're lying about everything. I'm a good mother. They're the ones who've emotionally abused my son. David nodded sympathetically, taking notes as I explained the birthday incident, the family meeting, the workplace sabotage. He seemed to be building a strategy until his phone rang. The color drained from his face during the brief conversation. I'm sorry, Ms. Chen, he said, hanging up. I've just been informed that I actually have a conflict of interest I wasn't aware of. My partner apparently has business dealings with your father's company. I can't represent you. The timing was too convenient, the excuse too flimsy. But I knew arguing would be pointless. They'd gotten to him somehow, just like everyone else. After 6 more attempts, I finally retained Sandra Morrison, a lawyer who seemed competent if overwhelmed. She warned me up front that she'd never handled a case against Whitman and Associates and that my parents' filing was unusually comprehensive. "They've been building this case for months, maybe longer," she said, flipping through the evidence. "Some of these documents are dated from last year. This isn't reactive, it's a long-term strategy." The worst was yet to come. That afternoon, the process servers appeared again, this time at Tommy's school. They served the papers to the principal in full view of other parents picking up their children, ensuring maximum humiliation. Tommy came out confused and scared, asking why the principal had looked at him strangely and why some of the other mothers were whispering. By evening, I'd received calls from 3 school parents asking if everything was okay, with tones suggesting they were really asking if their children were safe around mine. The school counselor sent an email requesting a meeting to discuss the family situation and its impact on Tommy's educational environment. My parents had weaponized the legal system to harm not just me, but my innocent son. The court documents revealed even more sinister planning. My parents had hired a private investigator months ago who'd been following us, photographing routine activities and spinning them into concerns. A photo of me checking my phone at the playground became mother ignoring child's need for attention. A picture of Tommy eating fast food became failure to provide nutritious meals. Even a shot of him playing video games was captioned as excessive screen time, indicating neglect. Sandra called an emergency meeting after reviewing everything. "There's something else you need to know. Your ex-husband has filed an affidavit supporting your parents' petition." The words hit like a physical blow. Brad and I had divorced amicably 3 years ago. He'd moved across the country for work and had minimal contact with Tommy beyond birthday cards and occasional video calls. We'd had no conflicts, no custody battles. This made no sense. The affidavit was full of lies. Brad claimed I'd been denying him access to Tommy, that I'd turned our son against him, that he'd witnessed concerning behavior during our marriage that now made sense in light of my mental health issues. The man who'd forgotten Tommy's last 2 birthdays was suddenly a concerned father worried about his son's welfare with an unstable mother. "This doesn't sound like Brad at all," I told Sandra, reading the formal language that was nothing like my laid-back ex-husband's communication style. "Someone else wrote this." Sandra nodded grimly. "The question is what they promised or threatened to get him to sign it. We need to find out, but he's not returning my calls." The next blow came from an unexpected source. The school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had always been supportive and kind. But her report to the court painted a different picture. She wrote about Tommy's emotional dysregulation after the birthday party, his concerning statements about family dynamics, and recommended immediate intervention to ensure the child's psychological well-being. She'd taken normal childhood upset about a cruel birthday gift and transformed it into evidence of parental failure. I confronted her after school, finding her in her office surrounded by photos from the recent school fundraiser. My parents featured prominently in several, their generous donation acknowledged with a new plaque on the wall. "How could you write those things?" I asked. "You know Tommy's a normal, happy child. You've seen how my parents treat him." Mrs. Patterson couldn't meet my eyes. "I wrote what I observed, Elizabeth. Your parents have been very concerned about Tommy's welfare. They've shared some troubling information about your biological family's mental health history. As a mandated reporter, I have to consider all factors." She paused, then added quietly, "They've also generously offered to fund a new counseling center for the school. One that could help children like Tommy who are struggling." The bribe wasn't even subtle. They were buying witnesses, purchasing testimony with charitable donations and promises of funding. But who would believe me over pillars of the community who gave so generously to local causes? Every institution I'd trusted, every professional relationship I'd built, was being turned against me with surgical precision. Friday brought the most devastating revelation yet. Sandra had managed to track down my former divorce attorney to ask about Brad's sudden involvement. What she learned confirmed my worst fears. "Your parents contacted Brad's lawyer during your divorce proceedings," she reported. They offered to pay his legal fees and help with his business loan if he signed certain agreements. One was about future custody issues. He essentially pre-agreed to support them if they ever sought grandparent rights. That was 3 years ago, I said numbly. They'd been planning this for 3 years? Sandra nodded. At least. They also paid your lawyer to ensure certain clauses weren't included in your divorce decree that would have protected you from this exact scenario. You were betrayed by your own attorney, and there's likely nothing we can do about it now. Attorney-client privilege works both ways. The preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks away. Sandra tried to prepare me, but her pessimism was obvious. The judge assigned to our case is Harold Fitzgerald. He's a member of your father's golf club. I've already filed for recusal, but it was denied. He says he can remain impartial despite the social connection. She didn't need to tell me how unlikely that was. My parents' legal team had assembled a case that painted me as an unfit mother teetering on the edge of mental collapse, denying loving grandparents access to a grandson who desperately needed their stable influence. They had witnesses, documents, expert opinions, and most importantly, they had the judge's ear every Sunday on the 9th hole. I had the truth, but in a courtroom, truth without proof is just noise. That night, after tucking Tommy into bed and assuring him everything would be okay, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by legal documents and tried not to despair. They'd isolated me from family, sabotaged my career, and now they were coming for my son. The systematic destruction of my life had been planned for years, executed with patience and unlimited resources. But as I looked at a photo of Tommy's smiling face, something hardened inside me. They might have every advantage, every connection, every resource. But I was his mother, and I would fight with everything I had. There had to be something they'd missed, some mistake in their careful planning. I just had to find it before the court date arrived, and they took the only thing that truly mattered, my son. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days before the court hearing. The woman on the other end identified herself as Margaret Sinclair from a law firm in Boston. Am I speaking with Elizabeth Chen, formerly Elizabeth Tran? She asked. My maiden name before adoption sent a chill through me. No one had called me that in over 30 years. Yes, but I don't understand. Who are you exactly? I represent the estate of Lillian Tran. Your biological grandmother. I'm sorry to inform you that she passed away last month, but I'm also calling because she's left you as the sole beneficiary of her estate. The words didn't compute. I sank into a kitchen chair, trying to process this information. That's impossible. My biological family. I was told they were all dead. My parents said there was no one to look for. Margaret's silence stretched too long before she responded. Ms. Chen, I think we need to meet in person. Can you come to Boston today? There are things you need to know, and documents you need to see immediately. Something in her tone suggested urgency beyond a simple inheritance. I thought of the court hearing, my dwindling bank account, and made a decision. I'll be there by noon. The drive to Boston gave me too much time to think. Why hadn't my biological family been mentioned during the adoption? My parents had always claimed I was orphaned with no living relatives, that they'd saved me from foster care. It was one of the many ways they'd reminded me to be grateful over the years. But if my grandmother had been alive all this time, what else had been a lie? Margaret Sinclair's office occupied the top floor of a historic building overlooking Boston Harbor. She was younger than I'd expected, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail as she welcomed me. The conference room she led me to was full of boxes, files, and photographs. But it was the portrait on the wall that stopped me cold. The woman looked exactly like me, just 60 years older. That's Lillian, Margaret said softly. Your grandmother. She spent the last 30 years looking for you. She handed me a letter, the envelope yellowed with age but the writing still clear. My hands shook as I read words written by a grandmother I'd never known existed, explaining how I'd been taken from her, how she'd never stopped searching, how she'd hired investigators and lawyers but always hit dead ends. I don't understand, I said, though pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. My parents said my biological mother died in childbirth and there was no other family. Margaret pulled out a file inches thick. Your mother did die young, but not in childbirth. Cancer, when you were 2. Your grandmother had custody, but there was a house fire when you were 3. You were presumed dead. Lillian always believed you survived, but the trail went cold. A fire? I had no memory of this, no scars, nothing. Margaret continued, the investigators she hired recently made a breakthrough. They found adoption records that had been sealed, supposedly destroyed. Your adoptive parents didn't go through normal channels. They had connections who helped them acquire a child without proper documentation. You were essentially trafficked, Ms. Chen, though they made it look legal enough. The room spun. Every story about my adoption, every tale of my parents' generosity in taking in an unwanted orphan, had been built on crimes. Why would they do that? I asked, though I suspected the answer. Margaret pulled out more documents. They were facing pressure to have children but couldn't conceive. Your adoptive father's business depended on projecting a family image. When you appeared through their network, they saw an opportunity. A child young enough not to remember, traumatized enough to be moldable. Then Claire came along, I said, understanding flooding through me. Their miracle biological child when I was a year old. And suddenly they had their real daughter and were stuck with me. Margaret nodded. The investigation suggests they tried to return you through the same network, but it had been dismantled. So they kept you, but... She gestured to my current situation, letting me fill in the decades of emotional abuse that followed. Now, about the inheritance, Margaret said, shifting to legal documents. Your grandmother was quite wealthy. Real estate development in Boston, tech investments that paid off enormously. She never married after losing her daughter and granddaughter, so she focused on building wealth and searching for you. The estate is valued at approximately $48 million, plus properties in Boston, New York, and Miami. I stared at the numbers, unable to process them. This morning I'd been worried about paying for groceries, and now. There's more, Margaret said carefully. When Lillian hired forensic accountants to trace what happened to you, they discovered something else. Your adoptive parents have been stealing from you for decades. She produced another file, this one full of bank statements and trust documents. Your biological mother had life insurance and a small inheritance from your grandfather. It should have gone to you, held in trust. Your adoptive parents somehow accessed it, claimed you had died in the fire, and took the money. They used it to start your father's business, to buy their first house, to fund Claire's education and business ventures. Everything they have was built on money stolen from you. The betrayal was so complete I felt numb. Every lecture about being grateful, every reminder that I owed them everything, had been projection of the highest order. They'd stolen my family, my inheritance, my entire life, and then made me feel indebted to them for it. Can we prove this? Can we get it back? I asked, thinking of the court hearing in 3 days. Margaret smiled for the first time. Your grandmother was thorough. We have documentation of everything. The statute of limitations is complicated, but fraud this extensive, involving identity theft and false death claims, opens up possibilities. More importantly for your immediate situation, we have recordings. She pulled out a small device and pressed play. My parents' voices filled the room, recorded at some society function years ago. They were drunk, boastful, telling the story to someone they trusted. How they'd acquired a child through creative means, how they'd accessed her trust fund, how they'd kept her ignorant of her biological family's searches. They laughed about telling me I should be grateful, about how I'd never know what they'd taken from me. My mother's voice was particularly cruel. She'll spend her whole life thinking she owes us, when really, we owe everything to her dead mother's money. Your grandmother had investigators at many of their social functions over the years, Margaret explained. She was building a case, hoping to find you and give you justice. She passed before she could execute her plans, but she left very specific instructions for me. She handed me a USB drive. Everything is here. Documents, recordings, forensic accounting, all of it. She also left you this. It was another letter, this one sealed. Inside, my grandmother's shaky handwriting spoke directly to my heart. My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, then Margaret found you after I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't see your face one more time, couldn't hold you and tell you how loved you've always been. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become, despite everything stolen from you. Use what I've left you not for revenge, but for justice. Build the life they tried to deny you. Love your son the way I never got to love you. You were never unwanted, never abandoned. You were stolen, but now you're found. I wiped away tears and looked at Margaret. What do I do now? I have a court hearing Friday where they're trying to take my son. Margaret's expression turned fierce. Now we fight back. I've already contacted a colleague who specializes in family law. With this evidence, we can not only defeat their petition but possibly see criminal charges filed. Are you willing to use what your grandmother found? Yes, I said without hesitation. They've taken enough. No more. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good. Then let's discuss strategy. First, we need to secure the evidence and make copies for law enforcement. Second, we file an emergency motion with the court about conflict of interest and fraud. Third, we contact the media. Your parents have built their reputation on lies and stolen money. It's time the community knew the truth. As we planned late into the evening, I thought about the birthday party that had started this final confrontation. A pair of socks for the worst grandson. They'd shown their hand that day, revealed just how much they hated us. But they'd also made a fatal error. They'd pushed too hard, become too confident in their power. Now their carefully constructed world was about to collapse, and they had no idea it was coming. Driving home with boxes of evidence and a new legal team's contact information, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Tommy would never have to endure their cruelty again. We had a family fortune they'd tried to steal, a grandmother's love they'd tried to hide, and most importantly, proof of decades of crimes. The court hearing they'd orchestrated to destroy us would instead become their downfall. Friday morning arrived with the kind of dramatic thunderstorm that seemed fitting for what was about to unfold. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the one I'd worn to important presentations back when I had a real career. Tommy stayed with a trusted neighbor, spared from witnessing what I hoped would be the end of his grandparents' reign of terror. Margaret had assembled a legal team that made Sandra Morrison gasp when she saw them enter the courthouse. "Is that Richard Hartwell?" she whispered, recognizing one of the state's most prominent criminal prosecutors. "What's he doing at a family court hearing?" I squeezed her hand gratefully. Sandra had offered to stay on as co-counsel despite being outgunned, wanting to see this through. "He's here because what started as a custody grab is about to become something much bigger," I told her. My parents arrived with their entourage 15 minutes early, projecting confidence and authority. My mother wore her favorite St. John suit, the one she wore when she wanted to remind everyone of her social standing. They didn't notice the federal marshal stationed discreetly around the courtroom, or the detective from the Financial Crimes Unit sitting in the back row. They were too busy greeting Judge Fitzgerald like the old friends they were. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Fitzgerald took his seat. He looked annoyed to see my expanded legal team, clearly expecting a simple proceeding where he'd grant his golf buddy's petition. "I see we have quite a crowd today," he said dryly. "This is a straightforward grandparents' rights hearing, not a criminal trial." Richard Hartwell stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that this case is anything but straightforward. In fact, we'll be filing criminal charges based on what we present today. We also move for your immediate recusal based on financial conflicts of interest we've discovered between yourself and the petitioners." The judge's face reddened, but before he could respond, Hartwell continued. "Specifically, the property your beach house sits on, which was purchased remarkably below market value from a company owned by Mr. Chen. The courtroom erupted. My father jumped to his feet, his lawyer trying to object over the chaos. But Hartwell wasn't done. He presented motion after motion, each one backed by evidence my grandmother's investigators had compiled. The judge, realizing he was caught, had no choice but to recuse himself. Within an hour, we had a new judge, one with no connections to my parents' country club network. Judge Patricia Reeves was known for her no-nonsense approach and particular hatred of fraud. She reviewed the initial filings with obvious skepticism. So, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, you claim your daughter is unstable and your grandson needs your intervention. Let's hear your evidence. My parents' lawyer, suddenly less confident without their tame judge, began presenting their case. But for every piece of manufactured evidence they presented, Hartwell had a counter. The edited videos from the birthday party? We had the full, unedited version showing my parents' cruelty. The workplace security breach? We had IT logs proving the access came from my mother's consultant keycard and Claire's home IP address. The concerned family statements? We had recordings of my parents coaching them on what to say, promising rewards for cooperation. The turning point came when Margaret took the stand as a witness. She calmly presented the evidence of my true identity, the stolen inheritance, the decades of fraud. She played recording after recording of my parents admitting to their crimes, their voices filling the courtroom with casual cruelty and criminal conspiracy. My mother's face went from confident to ashen as she heard herself bragging about stealing from a dead woman's baby. Your Honor, Hartwell said, approaching the bench with a thick folder. We have here evidence of identity theft, fraud exceeding $50 million, forgery of legal documents, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, among other crimes. The petitioners didn't adopt a child, they stole one and then systematically robbed her while emotionally abusing her for 30 years. Claire, who'd been smirking in the gallery, suddenly looked terrified as Hartwell continued. We also have evidence that Ms. Claire Patterson knowingly received stolen funds to start her business, fund her children's education, and purchase property. She's been an active participant in defrauding her adoptive sister. Claire's husband Mark was already moving away from her on the bench, his face revealing that this was news to him. My father tried to stand, to use his commanding presence to regain control. This is ridiculous. We saved this ungrateful girl from foster care. We gave her everything. But his voice lacked its usual authority, especially when the forensic accountant took the stand to detail exactly how they'd stolen my inheritance to fund their lifestyle. Every dollar was accounted for, every transaction traced. The detective from financial crimes stood up in the back. Your Honor, based on what's been presented today, I'm placing Mr. and Mrs. Chen under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The courtroom exploded again as officers moved in. My mother screamed about her reputation, her charity work, how they couldn't do this to pillars of the community. My father demanded to call his lawyer, apparently forgetting the one sitting next to him. Judge Reeves hammered her gavel repeatedly. Order. Based on the evidence presented, not only am I dismissing this petition for grandparents' rights, but I'm referring this entire matter for criminal prosecution. I'm also ordering an immediate freeze on all assets pending investigation of fraud claims. She turned to my parents, her disgust evident. In my 20 years on the bench, I've never seen such a calculated campaign of abuse disguised as parenting. As my parents were led away in handcuffs, their carefully maintained facades finally cracking, Claire tried to slip out. She was stopped by another officer with a warrant. The family members who'd supported them at the intervention sat frozen, realizing they'd been accomplices to massive fraud. Cousin Jenny was crying, whether from guilt or fear of prosecution, I couldn't tell. But the revelations weren't over. Brad's lawyer suddenly appeared, looking panicked. My client wants to make a statement, he announced. It turned out Brad had been flying in from California, ready to testify against me as promised. But he'd been watching the news coverage that had started during the hearing. Reporters had been tipped off, and the story of prominent citizens stealing a baby and her inheritance was already going viral. Brad took the stand voluntarily, looking exhausted and ashamed. They paid my business loan, threatened to have me blacklisted in my industry if I didn't sign those papers. But I can't do this anymore. Elizabeth was a good wife and is a wonderful mother. Everything in that affidavit was dictated by her parents. I'm sorry, Liz. I'm so sorry. His testimony added witness tampering and coercion to the growing list of charges. By afternoon, the courthouse was surrounded by media. The story had everything. Stolen babies, millions in fraud, society figures revealed as criminals. My parents' charity connections were distancing themselves at light speed. The country club released a statement suspending their membership. Patricia from my workplace called personally to apologize and offer my old position back with a substantial raise and back pay for the wrongful demotion. As I left the courthouse, Margaret walked beside me. Your grandmother would be so proud, she said quietly. You stood up to them with grace and strength. But I wasn't thinking about revenge or even justice in that moment. I was thinking about Tommy, about how he'd never have to receive cruel gifts or hear that he wasn't good enough. He had a great-grandmother who'd loved him before she even knew he existed, and an inheritance that would secure his future. That evening, the news was full of reports about my parents' arrest. Their photos were everywhere. The society couple revealed as fraudsters and child traffickers. Claire's business was already under investigation, her assets frozen alongside our parents'. Mark had filed for emergency divorce and custody of their twins, not wanting his children associated with the scandal. But the best moment came when Tommy ran into my arms after school, unaware of the day's drama. Mommy, my friend's mom said something about Grandma and Grandpa on the news. Are they okay? I knelt down to his level, choosing my words carefully. They're facing consequences for some bad choices they made, sweetheart. But we're okay. Better than okay, actually. We have a whole new family to learn about, people who've been looking for us and loving us from afar. That night, as Tommy slept peacefully, I opened the photo album Margaret had given me. Pictures of my biological grandmother, my mother, family members I'd never known existed. There was even one of me as a toddler, sitting on Lillian's lap, both of us smiling at the camera. We'd lost so many years, but her final gift had given us justice and a future free from the people who'd stolen so much. 6 months later, I stood in the grand hallway of my grandmother Lillian's Boston brownstone, now legally mine, watching Tommy chase his new cousins through rooms that echoed with laughter instead of lies. The transformation in our lives was so complete it sometimes felt like a dream. But the weight of the family heirloom watch on my wrist, the one my biological grandfather had worn, reminded me it was all real. The criminal trials had been swift and decisive. My adoptive parents were each sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The kidnapping charges were harder to prove after so many years, but the fraud was undeniable. Their assets were liquidated to pay restitution, though it was a fraction of what they'd stolen over the decades. The poetic justice of them ending up in prison uniforms instead of designer suits wasn't lost on anyone who'd known them. Claire had negotiated a plea deal, testifying against our parents in exchange for a reduced sentence of 3 years. Her business was dissolved, her reputation destroyed, and her husband Mark got full custody of the twins. In a twist of fate, Mark reached out to apologize for his role in the workplace sabotage and asked if the boys could still have a relationship with Tommy. I agreed, deciding the sins of the parents shouldn't punish innocent children. Besides, Tommy loved his cousins, and they needed stability after their world imploded. The Boston branch of my biological family had embraced us completely. I had aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd spent years wondering what happened to Lillian's lost granddaughter. They shared stories about my mother, showed me videos of family gatherings I should have been part of, and welcomed Tommy as if he'd always belonged. His 9th birthday party was a revelation, with 30 family members showing up with thoughtful gifts and genuine affection. My grandmother's fortune had been carefully managed and invested. Even after setting up trust funds for Tommy's education and future, I had more than enough to live comfortably while pursuing meaningful work. I'd returned to my marketing firm in a senior position, but I was already planning to leave and start the foundation I'd dreamed about. The Elizabeth Tran Foundation for Family Justice would help adopted children find biological families and provide legal support for those facing familial fraud. The foundation's first case came from an unexpected source. Jenny, my cousin who'd betrayed me at the intervention, reached out with her own story. It turned out my parents had been collecting strays for years, helping relatives adopt children through dubious channels and then holding it over them as leverage. Jenny's adopted daughter was one of 5 children we eventually helped reconnect with biological families who'd been searching for them. On a cool October morning, I sat in my grandmother's study, now my office, reviewing applications for the foundation's legal team. Tommy was at his new private school, thriving in an environment where his last name didn't come with whispered gossip. He joined the robotics club and made friends who knew nothing about our dramatic past. His asthma was well controlled with proper treatment we could now afford without worry. A knock at the door interrupted my work. Margaret entered with a box I hadn't seen before. "I'd been saving this for when you were settled," she said, placing it on my desk. "Lillian specifically asked that you receive this after everything was resolved." Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me but never sent. My grandmother had written to me every year on my birthday, pouring out her love and hope onto paper. Reading them was like having a conversation across time. She told me about my mother's favorite songs, her dreams of becoming a teacher, how proud she'd been when I was born. She shared family recipes, traditions I could now pass on to Tommy, and stories about ancestors who'd overcome hardship with grace. In the last letter, written just weeks before her death, she said, "I know you'll find these someday, my darling girl. You come from a long line of strong women who refuse to be broken by circumstances. Your strength isn't despite what you've endured, but because of how you've chosen to respond to it." Tommy burst through the door after school, full of excitement about a science project. "Mom, we're studying genetics and family trees. Can you help me with mine?" For the first time in his life, I could give him a complete picture. We spent the evening creating a family tree that included the Tran family history going back generations. He was fascinated by stories of his great-great-grandfather who'd immigrated from Vietnam, his great-grandmother Lillian who'd built a real estate empire, and his grandmother who'd dreamed of teaching. "What about Dad's side?" he asked. I'd maintained civility with Brad, who'd been genuinely remorseful about his role in the court drama. He'd started visiting monthly, trying to build a real relationship with Tommy. "We'll add that next time he visits," I promised. Co-parenting with someone who'd betrayed me wasn't easy, but Tommy deserved to know all parts of his heritage, even the complicated ones. The doorbell rang, and Tommy ran to answer it. He returned with a package addressed to both of us from the family in California. Inside was a photo album my biological aunt had assembled, filled with pictures of family members Tommy had yet to meet. There was also an invitation to the annual family reunion in San Francisco, something my grandmother had apparently started decades ago in hopes I'd eventually attend. That night, after Tommy was asleep, I stood in my grandmother's garden, now blooming with fall flowers I'd planted myself. The house that had sheltered her hope for so many years now sheltered her found family. Inside, Tommy's laughter during dinner still seemed to warm the walls. This was what my adoptive parents had tried to steal, not just money or property, but belonging, heritage, and unconditional love. My phone buzzed with a text from the prosecutor. They'd discovered more victims, more families torn apart by my adoptive parents' network. Each case we uncovered added years to their sentences and helped reunite stolen children with biological families. It was painful work but necessary. Every reunion reminded me that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied. I thought about the birthday party that had started our journey to freedom. Those socks, meant to humiliate and hurt, had instead been the catalyst for discovering our true family. My parents had been right about one thing: they were the worst gift. But not for the reason they'd intended. They were the worst because they represented the last time my adoptive parents would ever hurt my son. Their cruelty had exposed their crimes, and their crimes had led us home. As I headed inside, I passed the formal dining room where we'd held our first real Thanksgiving. Tommy had stood up and given a toast that left everyone in tears. "I'm thankful for my mom who fought for us, for my new family who looked for us, and for great-grandma Lillian who never gave up hope. I wish I could have met her, but I promised to make her proud." The next morning brought news that my adoptive parents' appeal had been denied. They would serve their full sentences, no early release, no minimum security country club prison. Their fall from grace was complete. The society pages that once featured their charity galas now detailed their crimes. The country club had not only revoked their membership but also removed their names from all plaques and donor walls. But I found I no longer cared about their fate. My focus was on building the life they'd tried to deny us. The foundation was helping dozens of families. Tommy was thriving. I'd found love again with David, a fellow adoptee who understood the complicated emotions of discovering your true identity later in life. He and Tommy had bonded over robotics and terrible puns, filling our home with the kind of easy laughter I'd never known in childhood. As Tommy's 10th birthday approached, I asked him what kind of party he wanted. "Just family," he said without hesitation. "All of them. Even the cousins we just found last month." "And Mom?" "No socks, please." We laughed, but I heard the healing in his voice. He could joke about it now because it no longer had power over him. The worst gift had become just another family story, one that ended with finding where we truly belonged. The morning of his birthday, Tommy opened a special gift from his great-grandmother Lillian, one Margaret had saved for this occasion. It was a leather journal with his initials embossed in gold, and inside, a note in her shaky handwriting: "For my precious great-grandson, loved beyond measure before we ever met. Fill these pages with your dreams, knowing you come from people who never gave up on theirs. Love, Great-Grandma Lillian." Tommy hugged the journal to his chest, then looked up at me with eyes that sparkled with joy instead of tears. "She really loved us, didn't she? Even without knowing us?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "That's what real family does," I finally managed. "They love you for who you are, not what you can do for them. They fight for you, search for you, and never, ever give up on you." As family members arrived throughout the day, bearing gifts chosen with thought and care, our home filled with the chaos of cousins playing, adults laughing, and stories being shared across generations. This was what my adoptive parents had feared most. That I would find my real family and discover I'd always been worthy of love. They'd spent decades trying to convince me I should be grateful for scraps while stealing my birthright. But their worst gift had revealed their best-kept secret, and in losing them, I'd gained everything. The party lasted well into the evening, with impromptu music from cousins who'd inherited our grandmother's piano skills and stories that connected us to our shared history. As I tucked an exhausted but happy Tommy into bed that night, he sleepily asked, "Mom, do you think Great-Grandma can see us now? Do you think she knows we're okay?" I kissed his forehead and smoothed his hair, thinking of all the birthday letters she'd written to a granddaughter she couldn't find. "I know she does, baby. And you know what? We're more than okay. We're home." What would you do if your family betrayed you for decades? Have you ever discovered that the people who were supposed to love you most were the ones hurting you deepest? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph over family betrayal. Remember, sometimes losing toxic family members means finding your true tribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they deserve better than scraps disguised as love. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may you always know your worth, regardless of who tries to diminish it.